Amend the Mass Media Group's e-store is now live.
We've got Reparations Now, Policy Over Party, and Cut the Check, branded merch and hoodies, hats, and tees, and even V-necks for the ladies.
You can even get a commemorative, one-of-a-kind Cut the Check spatula spreader. The engraved keepsake life knife is guaranteed for a lifetime and can be passed down to future generations. Go to etmmediagroupstore.com.
That's etmmediagroupstore.com. Right now, as always, appreciate you.
Visit ETM Media Group online merch store and Cutco the check.
James Alexander, J. Alexander.
Okay, all right, where you from, bro?
I'm from Compton, California, born and raised.
Compton, in
Sir.
the building. Now, how long did you live in Compton? Are you still living in Compton?
No, I currently live in Bakersfield, but
Okay.
I lived in Compton Compton South Central area for about 18 years. Actually, I'm from the 90059, which is a very unique part of Los Angeles. If anybody knows it, they know that that is the only place in Los Angeles where Compton, Watts, and South Central touch at the corners of Imperial and Central. So you hear people say they're from South Central, you hear people say they're from Compton, and you hear people say they're from Watts. But I'm from the only area where all three of those areas touch on the corner, and that's the 90059. Myself and rapper J-Rock.
J-Rock, peace out. All right, so let's talk about I guess let's get into Compton.
Okay.
And we're just gonna have a conversation. So let's get into Compton, and then I also want to talk about, because you say you also served in the military. Is that
Yes,
correct?
sir.
Okay.
Proud veteran.
Shout out, salute. So I definitely want to get in that too. But let's talk about Compton. So can you tell us about just growing up in Compton, and then I also want to ask you. I've noticed the demographic has changed over the years in Compton, but can you just let the people know like how you grew up in Compton, what it was like?
Okay, I was born and raised in Compton. My parents lived across the street from each other. And, I grew up there. I went to church there. I attended schools. My grandmother lived there, a lot of my family members. So I did a lot of growing up, playing and developing into a young man in Compton. So around 5 years old, we moved just right outside of what would be considered Compton, which is South Central, but it's just separated by a street. So it's still very much Compton atmosphere.
Okay, so when you lived in Compton, what was the demographic like? Did
The
you
demographic
live around
was,
a lot of black people?
Oh yeah, it was
Latinos?
predominantly
Okay.
black.
All
Growing
right.
up, right naturally, it was predominantly black. It was sharecroppers, a lot of sharecroppers. A lot of people, or to include my family, migrated from the south, sharecropping. They sharecropped through Texas, through Arizona, from Bakersfield all the way into Compton, depending on the season. And many of my family members, great aunts and uncles, settled in Bakersfield. My great grandparents are currently buried in Bakersfield, and a couple of more of my great aunts and uncles continue to migrate on, to include my grandmother, continue to migrate on into Compton. And she raised my mother along with her siblings. My mother had me, and the rest is my story.
Okay, so I noticed a change in Compton in terms of like the demographics and ethnic group. Can you kind of explain over the years what was taking place in Compton?
Okay. I would have to say near the late 70s, early 80s was when the demographics started to change. Quite naturally, immigration affects black neighborhoods because when immigrants come, and they normally are pushed into black neighborhoods, um, they become part of black schools and black communities. And so it was no different in Compton. In late 70s, early 80s, we started to see one or two Mexican families move in. We would start to see one or two Mexican families in our classroom, or Mexican kids in our classrooms. I think there was only like 2 of them in my first and second grade. And by the time I got to junior high school, we started to have more and more immigrant families in our community. And when the 80s hit, we started to see drugs come in and decimate a lot of the working class that was living in Compton, and a lot of those people started losing their homes. And so the people that came in replacing them were of a lighter shade.
Okay, so since you spoke about, what happened, especially to the black community during, I'm assuming you're talking about that was during the crack era?
Yeah, it started roughly around 81, 82, when you start to see some of the changes in the neighborhood. One of the immediate changes that you start to see was an increase in the homeless populace and those that were suffering from medical ailments. I lived, like right there in the area that I described is a well-known hospital by the name of Martin Luther King Hospital. It's well-known in Compton. And around that same amount of time, right next to Martin Luther King is a mental health hospital, Augustus Hawkins, who was also a Freemason, a Prince Hall Freemason. But Augustus Hawkins housed many of the mentally ill. But in the 80s, thanks to President Reagan, a lot of those hospitals released those patients, and you started to see an increase of people living on the streets because they no longer had facilities that housed them. And so you started to see the demographics as far as home ownership, as far as immigrants, families moving in, but you also started to see the streets start to become more populated with those that were medically or mentally ill.
Now, what do you think, because I like to have these conversations, because on our platform, we try to get deep into the core issues, especially with what happened to our black community. So, right now they're always talking about these opioids and what's happening to, let's be specifically, I'm not saying it's not happening to the black community, but it's predominantly happening to the white community. And now it's all of a sudden it's like, well, it's an epidemic, right? So from your perspective, can you let us know like the difference between this kind of idea and concept where we need to try to tackle this epidemic, comparatively speaking, to what happened to the crack era, where it was basically a war on drugs in the black community?
That's an interesting question, and I don't know if I'm actually the person that can answer that question, because that's not my field of expertise. But what I can expand on is my experience, my lived experience. Going through the 80s and the 90s and seeing the crack epidemic explode, we really didn't know what was happening at that time. A strawberry, a crackhead, these things were brand new to us. We could look back at it now with 30 years of history and definition and say that's absolutely something that you don't want to be. But in the 70s and the 80s, when crack was first released on our community, people didn't know what the results of it would be. You didn't know that you would lose your house, lose your job, lose your family, lose all hope. These things there was no illustration for us to see and understand that. Now, having that experience, I can look at the next so-called epidemic and only imagine what will be the result of that 30 years from now. And I can say that if it's anything like the crack epidemic, it's going to be horrible. And so I can understand why they have the illustration to look back on of what crack did to us and say, we absolutely don't want that to happen in our communities with opioids. But for me, the experience is a lived one. It's not one that I studied or had to read about or researched. It's one I actually saw. When I when there were neighbors who I can go over to their houses and play with their kids, and then I start to see those neighbors who had manicured yards start to let their properties go and lose their jobs, and some of these people who had mobile homes and vans and multiple cars, I can go through the neighborhood now and find them living in those old vehicles under freeway passes, you know. And so to understand that this was someone that was once respected in my community, they held a job, they had families, kids that I played with, and now they are recovering from the drugs on war, the war on drugs, I'm sorry, and you know, some of the other post-traumatic things that they've lived through as just being black in America.
All right, so during the time from your experience during this crack era, what was the rehabilitation process like? Did you see people getting rehabilitated? Was there any programs or services?
No, the rehabilitation process is non-existent. I mean, you saw it individually when you saw church members or family members try to grab hold to their individual family member and try to get them back to a baseline of normalcy. But as far as programs coming into our community and helping us, no, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen anything like that. I've only seen the destruction and the availability and and you know, like I said, I grew up with it. I saw it. So at a time like new music, it was a fad. You know, to see a drug dealer driving Nissan trucks or having KMC rims or big chains and different things like that, it looked glamorous. And so you would think that only the dummies were doing the drugs until you find that majority of the people that were being fed these drugs were educated, were hardworking, were professionals. And so we look at them now in their current state and say, oh, you were a fool. But if you sit down and have a conversation with a lot of them, you'll find out that they had great jobs. They had you know, a lot of opportunities. And I know that as far as the task force, you hear people call in and they say, well, what are they going to do with the reparations money? They're going to go buy drugs, or they're going to buy some. And I know that that's a position that some people take, but I'm of the position that I've experienced what black people will do with no money. Like I said, I lived in neighborhoods where a majority of the homeowners were black. They had great paying jobs. They had families. They attended church. They were deacons and school teachers. They taught us swim lessons. So they were actually in our neighborhoods, and they were people who were responsible for not just rearing the children, their own children, but bringing up the community's children. And so we did all that, and we created these kind of communities and towns all across the nation with no reparations. So I argue that giving black people reparations, particularly those descendants of slaves that are entitled to it, will not result in us going out buying a whole bunch of name brands, but will result in us taking back our communities and taking back our families.
Wonderful. Two more questions. Two more quick questions. Maybe quick. I don't know. Kind of want to talk about your military experience.
Okay.
One, how did you get involved in the military? Why did you get involved into the military? I guess it's a two-part question. And what part of the military did you serve in?
Okay, I'm a proud veteran of the U.S. Army, and I come from a military family. So my dad was a Korean War veteran. My uncle was a Vietnam era veteran. And so I got a chance to see them growing up. I got a chance to visit my uncle at a military facility at Fort Lewis in Washington when I was a kid. And so I got a chance to see how he was living, and I liked it. I grew up watching military movies, you know. I like General Custer, and I told my dad when I was younger that I wanted to go to West Point. And so that was my dream, to go to West Point all throughout my formative schooling years. However, when I got to high school, junior high school and high school, I joined the ROTC. And my path led me into the enlisted area. I didn't go to West Point, but I went into the enlisted. And I served as a military police. I served in Iraq. and it was, I would have to say, the best time of my life. It allowed me to see the world. It let me meet people and allowed me to understand that there was so much more than where I was coming from, and there was so much more that I can do. And so as a result of that, I have 3 sons that are currently veterans. One served in Iraq, one served in Afghanistan, and one just returned from South Korea. So I'm a military family, and it's a tradition that I'm very proud of.
All right. Well, salute, man. Appreciate your service.
Thank you. And I currently work as a veteran advocate. I've been working for veteran advocacies for the last 25, 30 years. 30 years. And, it's something that I take a lot of pride in. And that's exactly what I'm looking at as it relates to this reparation. Mm-hmm. Because like I said, a lot of people that I knew in my neighborhood were veterans. I talked to them. I knew them. I knew how they got their homes. My dad got his house through the GI Bill, so around the kitchen table, he would talk about other veterans who had got their homes and stuff through the GI Bill. So I knew there was opportunity for me to be able to secure property and do that when I got older. And so to go through those neighborhoods and see these veterans that are now on the streets, my concern is, who's going to help them with their reparations? You may have heard me in the task force. I spoke against freedmen farming, which is going out grabbing homeless people off the street once reparations come in and saying, hey, you need to be under conservatorship. We got a lot of money for you, but you can't be in charge of it. So you sign here and we'll give you $500 a month out of the $5 million or so that they're supposed to be getting, and someone else controls their money. And so that's something that I feel like I want to advocate for. Veterans, making sure that someone stands up for them in this reparations field.
Man, makes total sense to me. All right, so one quick question, or maybe might be 2-part, because I'm just going off top of the head now. So, 1, what does reparations look like to you?
Okay.
So that's the first part of the question. And 2, what do you think, have you been following the San Francisco reparations at all?
Okay. I would say that the San Francisco recommendation of $5 million, I've been following it about as long as it's been announced and in the news. Mm-hmm. And so I've heard Reverend Amos's position, and I'm interested to see what the city does. I know that it's just one person. Reparations consist of cash payouts. It consists of some land. So I believe in dollar housing, particularly for veterans. That's something that I believe in. So I think that some kind of restitution, as it relates to American descendants of slaves or freemen, something that will help them in the future. I don't think that a park or a civic center or anything like that, like I said, I'm from South Central Compton area. If you went back and built a park or a civic center or community center there, I'm not taking my kids back there just because that's where I grew up. I grew up and moved away from there. So whatever will be a Martin Luther King Center there today would just be a Cesar Chavez Center in about 20 years, because the people who live there aren't continuing to live there. We've been priced out of Compton and Los Angeles. So it doesn't do any good for me to say, hey, this is the area that I was from and this is the area that was harmed, and then you go build a civic center or a park in that area. I don't live in that area no more. So I think that cash reparations will be, a must, along with some of the other recommendations that have been put out. But I definitely believe that the Freedmen Bureau needs to be established, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Veteran Affairs. And I have some interesting, I wouldn't say interesting, or I wouldn't say unique, but I would say interesting opinions as it relates to the Freedmen's Bureau. I believe that it needs to at least cover 3 primary functions, like the Department of Veteran Affairs does. I believe it needs to have a health branch that deals with any kind of health ailments or problems that we have as freedmen. We need to have a mental health and physical health branch, and then there needs to be a benefits branch as it relates to monies, properties, education, anything as it relates to benefits, that then there needs to be a national cemetery branch to make sure that they, so that freedmen don't have to buy lots of land, plots to be buried in. And there should also be a freedman head marker to, if you are a descendant of a slave, a child of slavery, that you should have a head marker that states that this individual is foundation. So that's what reparations look like on just a small town. I mean, I have other ideas and other ideas that I've heard that I agree with, but that's what I would like to see: cash payments and the reestablishment of the Freedmen's Bureau with those protections.
All right, yeah, and I always encourage people to submit their ideas or proposals to the California Reparations Task Force, so everybody can.
I'll be DMing
all
them,
day.
You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not really a verbal person in the chat rooms. I hear a lot of the chat rooms going, and a lot of it is just iron sharpening iron. I hear a lot of people arguing, but I get a lot of information through those areas, that and a lot of questions answered from a lot of intelligent people that are on there, and it kind of gets me to go out and start studying and looking into doing more myself. So when I do have an idea or something, trust me, I DM those that I do know in the task force, and if they use it, they use it. I heard some stuff today presented that I've presented before, and I'm not gonna say they got it from me, but it's good to know that they were thinking along the same line. I heard it, and I said, okay, somebody's covering that, somebody's looking into that, you know, and that's something that you can just ask for. Just people to constantly be looking for ways to improve this movement.
All right, well, appreciate it. So, can people reach out to you? I know you said you're involved in the veteran, initiatives. Is there any way people can reach out if they want more information from you?
I'll try to do veteran advocacy as much as I can, trying to help veterans make that transition from the military life back into the civilian world. So if you need any help or assistance with trying to get your VA benefits or get into the VA hospital, get some kind of mental health or care, I can be reached at james.brannon@va.gov, and my Twitter spaces are, you can find me on Twitter as J. Alexander Brannon.
Okay, can you just say that one more, hold the mic up just a little bit more, so we could just hear the last contact, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, you can find me on Twitter as J. Alexander Brannon, BRANNON.
Okay, and I know did you say your email address too?
Yeah, well, that's my work email address. If it's veteran related and you need help with veterans advocacy or assistance like that, you can reach me at james.brannon, BRANNON, @va.gov.
Wonderful. All right, thanks, brother. Appreciate it.